Sara Hill. Sara Hill was appointed to serve as the Attorney General of the Cherokee Nation in 2019. Prior to that, she's been a decade in the nation's Office of the Attorney General and served as the Cherokee Nation's first Secretary of Natural Resources. Her legal career has been entirely in Indian country, where she has worked on a wide range of legal issues facing tribes. General Hill has a Bachelor of Arts from Northeastern State University in Tahlequah and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Tulsa. She has won numerous awards for her legal and environmental work. Attorney General Hill is leading the charge of moving the Cherokee Nation into a new era of law and justice in the Cherokee Nation Reservation. On a personal note, Sara Hill, Attorney General Sara Hill, is a lovely individual, and I have so much confidence in where our tribe is headed because I know she and her team are leading that charge. So at this time, please help me welcome Attorney General Sara Hill.
Such a lovely introduction. I have so many friends and coworkers at Cherokee Nation that have been a blessing on my life. Jen is one of those people. There are many people in this room that you know that you're those people too, people who are great to work with. And I am grateful every day that I've been given an opportunity to serve the Cherokee people. So I'm here to talk to you. I know it's the third day of the conference. You guys might be a little bit tired. Will this come out? You might be a little bit tired. If you're like me, sometimes you get a little bit tired no matter what you're doing. There's always a list of things that you have to do, a list of problems that you have to solve. You think about all the people that depend on you. You think about your personal life and the things that you struggle with. You think about your professional life and the list of needs that pile up. And getting away to a conference can feel good in some ways. It's a change of pace. It's a chance to stop and reassess the work that you do, to think about the great contributions and the changes that are going on. And then you also have to face the fact that you got to go back to that office and you have to go back to the people that you serve pretty soon, and you have to get back to work. So we're going to take a deep breath here for a minute collectively. I'm going to take a deep breath with you because I'm right there with you, dealing with the problems in Indian country, and talk about the past and the future, maybe in a broader scope. Let's take a step back a little bit and talk about where we're at and where we might be going in Indian country, because I think that these are the big picture things that are easy to get lost in the day-to-day work of our lives. You keep solving one problem after another, and maybe you don't see the impact. It feels like there's never any end. The list of defendants in their criminal court, you see that same name come up again, and you already know what's going to be on the report before you look at it because you've seen that report 4 different times before. Or you see the same victim come back again. And it can be difficult sometimes to feel like, what's the good that I'm doing here? And you're doing so much good. We are collectively doing so much good. And we're going to talk about that too, the future that we're creating for ourselves. So I'm going to talk about, the work that sovereigns do. I'm a lawyer, so I talk about lawyer things like tribal sovereignty. But tribal sovereignty doesn't really, that phrase, people use it a lot, but they rarely connect it to the work that people do. And the work of tribal sovereigns is done by humans. It's done by people like the people in this room. It includes lots of different things. But we're going to talk about the perceptions versus the reality of how tribes work with the state of Oklahoma. Talk about the role of tribal self-governance, which you are all you have starring roles in the work of tribal self-governance. So we're going to talk about that role. And then finally, talk about visions for the future of Oklahoma, which to me is also about, I heard a term I think used in more of the art world, more Jen's world than in mine, but indigenous futures. What does that look like? Are we looking at something old or something totally new and different? So if you think about McGirt, and I can't, this is sort of billed as a McGirt update, but I presume that a lot of you sort of have had to live and breathe the idea of McGirt for some time. But it creates in a lot of people's minds one of 2 different ideas. Either you think about McGirt as this concept of Well, McGirt changed everything, right? It utterly changed the world. And if you might be forgiven for thinking that that's the case, especially if you read some of the editorials that came out after McGirt, if you saw some of the news features that came out, you would think, wow, this must be a big deal. Look at the governor. He seems to think this is a pretty big deal. It's really going to change Oklahoma in really fundamental ways. Or you might also think, and on the same slide, there's another picture there which shows, the Cherokee Nation doing sort of what this is post-McGirt, the Cherokee Nation making a donation to local law enforcement. That's something the Cherokee Nation does, that most tribes in Oklahoma do at different times, give money to local law enforcement. And so some people might also think, McGirt, what is McGirt? McGirt doesn't really touch my life. It doesn't really seem to impact me. I think it involves something to do with Indians, might be your average Oklahoman's take on that. They don't really have a concept of what it is. And to understand it, you have to look a little bit at the past, I think, to see how something can be both life-changing and a very big deal, and also kind of not such a big deal at all, depending on your point of view. So if you go back in time, if you rewind Oklahoma back to pre-statehood, then you had these really big and these really powerful Indian tribes that had sovereignty, had criminal jurisdiction over their reservations. There was no question about their reservations or about their jurisdiction over them. And after statehood, you see Oklahoma really began to act as if the tribes sort of disappeared, as if some tragic legal situation happened and the tribes, their reservations were gone, even though they couldn't really point to a single legal thing that would make that happen. And you did see real tragedy in Oklahoma then. Well, fast forward that a little bit to the 1940s and 50s, when my parents were born, and during that time period, Oklahoma had been really successful with the help of the United States in suppressing tribal governments and how they operated. And so you begin to see in Oklahoma where the tribes, sort of this fundamental the mistruth, this misinformation that happened at statehood, that something happened to the tribes, that they went away, had really begun to take root in the hearts and minds of people, and it had begun to take root in Oklahoma law. And Oklahoma courts had issued rulings that said that, the state has jurisdiction throughout Indian country, including on tribal trust land, including on allotted lands, including on lands that we call dependent Indian country. They have jurisdiction everywhere. And that was sort of the state of affairs in the 1940s and 50s. And the question is, when did that, eventually that started to crumble. And that started to crumble in the 1970s and 80s as you began to see tribal lawyers begin to challenge some of those rulings because they were just inconsistent with what the law really required. And a question that you might ask is why was it the 70s and 80s? Why didn't that happen in 1940? And the answer, I think, is because in the 1970s and 80s, tribes began to have self-governance compacts. They began to have access, they were able to organize their governments democratically again. They were able to elect their own leaders and to hire tribal employees and attorneys to represent their interests and to make arguments on their behalf. And you began to see this sort of reemergence of Indian country in Oklahoma in small ways. I mean, these were not huge cases at first. One of the clippings that I've seen that I saw was shared with me from my good friend Susan Work, who's a Choctaw and a tribal attorney. And it was one that her mother had clipped because she had been involved in that case. So it's a literal newspaper clipping from the late 1970s or early 1980s. And in it, there was one parcel of dependent Indian community that the local judge had been convinced by the argument of the attorneys involved that, yeah, this is tribal jurisdiction. The state doesn't have jurisdiction here. So when this crime occurred and an Indian committed a crime on this area, the state lacks jurisdiction. And you should read the quote from the sheriff in that case. The quote is astounding. It is breathless. It is, how can I be expected to maintain order in this county when there is this 200-acre parcel of property where the state lacks jurisdiction over Indians? It's a travesty. It's unimaginable. It's shaken to the very core the authority of the sheriff in this county. I mean, it was that level of breathlessness about it. And I thought as I read that, my, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So a question of how much McGirt changed the world to me is a question of perspective, right? To that gentleman in that county in the early 1980s or late 1970s, that absolutely rocked his world because it changed his perception of what Oklahoma was, his perception of what Oklahoma was and what Oklahoma Indian country was. And so then you see, this is the beginning, right? This is the small beginnings of what would ultimately become much, much bigger pieces. Then you see cases like Ross v. Neff, where we're like, okay, now it's clear the state lacks jurisdiction over allotted lands, period. The state lacks jurisdiction over tribal trust lands, period. And there should never have really been any dispute about that under the law. It's not as if there was new law that was created during that time. Oklahoma just began following the law that already existed at the time. And so understanding it from that point of view, I think it's easier for you to understand than McGirt, right? So you see then all of this culminates into this decision in 2020 in McGirt, where the Supreme Court says, yeah, Oklahoma's not the special snowflake place that many Oklahoma lawyers, state of Oklahoma lawyers believed that it was. Maybe the rules of federal Indian law apply in Oklahoma just like they apply everywhere else in the United States. And the reservations of the Muskogee Nation, and then of course, within a few months after that, the reservations of the 5 tribes were never disestablished, and the tribes have jurisdiction over Indian country. And you see, again, the same, I mean, you could have pulled that quote from 1980, just put it right into the headlines in 2020. That same reaction, some people feeling like, this is the end. Oklahoma isn't the place that we thought it was. What about the land runs? What was that about? If we don't have one whole state over which the state has complete jurisdiction, how can that possibly be the answer? That's inconsistent with what I believed. Not what the law said, not what the treaties required, but it's inconsistent with what many people believed, especially people who are in charge of law enforcement, who particularly keenly felt that. But it really isn't inconsistent with the law. And many people, then if you look at people who are actually in Oklahoma in 2020, like, probably most of the people in this room, there were these amazing television interviews that appeared where the governor would talk about the chaos that was being caused by McGirt. And I'd be in line at Starbucks and Telecall, and I'm like, I just don't see it. It seems fine to me. It seems like everything's more or less okay. It doesn't seem like chaos to me. I certainly saw an increase in caseload. There are certainly changes, right? Because the Cherokee Nation Attorney General's office went from filing, between 60 and 100 criminal cases in a single year prior to McGirt. Post McGirt, we would file 3,700 cases that first year post McGirt. So it's not that I didn't feel it. I felt it as much as anyone really did, except poor Sandy Crosland, who I see in the audience, who is in charge of my criminal division. She probably felt it the most. But there was all of the tribes had to deal with this big impact, this influx of cases. But we handled it because we had to, because that's the obligation of the sovereign. That's the work of tribal sovereignty. It was victim witness coordinators. Do we have any victim witness folks in this room who do that work? Raise your hands for me so I can see you. If you work with victims at One Fire or at any kind of domestic violence program, if you help victims, you saw that. You noticed McGirt, right? If you work, especially for a tribal agency, that changed, that upended your life a little bit. Are there people that work in law enforcement in this room? If you're law enforcement, raise your hand for me. Got some law enforcement folks. You probably got real familiar, if you weren't already, with the little card that explains are you an Indian or not an Indian defendant? If so, you go to tribal court, or you go to state court, you go to federal court. So there were a lot of new things to learn, but I don't think that you could describe that situation as chaos. It was perhaps more chaotic at times than it had to be, but it was something that the tribes and the state were able to work through. And I know that because I see it every single day. I get reports from state law enforcement, and state law enforcement officers, I would never for a second discount their strong feelings about McGirt. Many of them feel strongly that McGirt was wrongly decided. They're unhappy with the way the changes that occurred in Indian country. And I can understand why they feel that way. But I can tell you, when they bring those reports to our office, they're more than they feel disappointed about the results in McGirt. They feel like it's their job to see prosecutions occur in criminal cases where they have been responsible for writing those reports. And they bring those reports to our tribal prosecutors, and we prosecute those cases. So at the ground level with law enforcement officers, they may have their own feelings about it, but it hasn't changed the way that they work collaboratively and cooperatively with the tribe to get those cases brought. Because just like, we all know that, let me go back here. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate. These are communities that we all share. Whether you're an Oklahoma law enforcement officer at the county level, whether you're a Cherokee Nation marshal or a light horse, domestic violence doesn't discriminate. Anyone can be a victim of a crime, and when you're a victim of a crime, you expect law enforcement to show up and to assist you. And post McGirt, you see that just like you saw prior to McGirt. You call 911, a law enforcement officer is going to come to your door, and they're going to try to help you if they can. That's the quality of law enforcement folks that we have in eastern Oklahoma. It crosses all jurisdictional boundaries. It did prior to McGirt. I mean, it's not as if we didn't have tribal police prior to McGirt. We certainly did. And even prior to McGirt, when those jurisdictional boundaries got crossed, what we would do is we would sit down with the state prosecutor or with the U.S. prosecutor, and we would work out those issues so that we could be sure that the offender was brought to justice. And what we do post-McGirt is exactly the same thing that we did prior to McGirt. We just do it more often, and it requires even more collaboration and more coordination. We have everyone who's opposed to violence in our communities. We really don't have a choice in the matter. There isn't any box that you get to check that says, I get to do my job except when it's in some way distasteful to me. Or I get to do my job except when it requires me to work with people that I don't want to work with. We say we are opposed to violence, and we are going to hold abusers accountable for the things they do, no matter who and no matter where. And that is the ethos that I think prosecutors and law enforcement and all of the people involved in domestic violence have to bring to it. That these matters, these issues of jurisdiction are very important, and I'm the Attorney General of the Cherokee Nation. You're not going to hear me say that those issues aren't important. They're incredibly important. But the job is to make sure that our communities are safe, and that requires cooperation and collaboration. And this isn't a new thing. I mean, this is what my chief has been saying for some time, and I'll let you read his comment here. But I mean, this has been the continual position of the Cherokee Nation. You see it in the way that the Cherokee Nation's money is spent, the donations that it makes to tribal and non-tribal law enforcement officers, makes to tribal and non-tribal nonprofits that operate in our communities. It's not a problem that we can solve individually, but a problem that only can be solved by working together. So we have to follow the lead of the people in charge of our tribe. And in my case, that's this guy right here. He's the elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And that's not just because he's a good guy, which of course I think he is, but because that's what tribal governments do. It's about tribal self-governance. It's all the different ways that tribes express their, tribes take control of their own governments, take control of their own situations. It's really easy to let back and let other people lead, but it's not helpful to tribal communities to sit back and let other people lead. It is helpful to tribal communities when tribal communities are able to identify their own problems, to deal, because I think tribal communities are better at dealing internally with what are the real problems that we're facing. We know our communities, we know what's wrong, and we know what works and what doesn't work. And having elected leaders who are directly accountable to those tribal communities, they have to select what are those things that are priorities in our communities? What are those interventions that will help solve these problems? What do my citizens demand of me? That's a very accountable government. And that's what tribal governments provide that tribal people don't get if their tribal governments are washed away. And so that's why I think anybody who works for a tribal government, raise your hand if you work for a tribal government in this room. Okay. Look at all of you people. You are involved in you are the work of tribal sovereignty. You do the work of tribal sovereignty because you've been employed by your government to solve the problems of the people. And that is the power, that is the magic. That was the magic that made us go from the 1940s situation where tribes had very little control over their own destiny to the 1970s and 80s where you see tribes begin to take off. That is the difference between the tribal clinics that are operated by tribal governments versus the ones that are operated by IHS, which is no shade on the IHS employees, but tribal clinics that are owned and operated by the tribes are much larger and meet the needs of tribal communities much better. And it's not just health, it's law enforcement, it's tribal prosecution. In every metric that you can imagine, tribal people are better served when they are served by their own governments who are solving their problems in governments that are held accountable to them. That's the difference. That's the magic of tribal sovereignty and self-governance. And that's why lawyers like me go into court and fight the fight of tribal sovereigns. That's why we go into court and insist that the reservations still exist and we have to defend that. Why we fight for our jurisdiction, because if we don't have the right to say, if my government can't create its own laws, and if we can't be governed by those laws, then we begin to lose the magic, right? And tribal governments, tribal people do less well, they're less successful. And you can see this in VAWA is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. So there's a couple of cases here, McBratney and Oliphant. These are a couple of difficult cases for Indian country. McBratney from 1881 said that the courts of the United States, so the federal courts, have no jurisdiction to punish a crime between two non-Indians. So if a non-Indian kills another non-Indian, then the federal court has no jurisdiction in Indian country. That stays in the state court. So that was an invasion into a zone that the tribes had typically defended against state sovereignty, right? Now the state can now bring its power in and it can prosecute a crime in Indian country. That seems normal to us now, but that happened in 1881. Then in 1978, there was an even bigger incursion into tribal sovereignty, Oliphant, and it said that tribes do not have an inherent jurisdiction to punish non-Indians who commit crimes in Indian country. So now, the United States can't prosecute a non-Indian who commits a crime against another non-Indian. The tribes can't prosecute non-Indians at all in their own reservations. I think it creates a pretty obvious problem that anyone who works in domestic violence knows very well in Indian country. You've got non-Indians who can come into an Indian reservation and commit crimes against Native women. The only entity who could hold them accountable was the United States. And the United States, in many areas, was not set up to prosecute domestic violence crimes. The FBI and federal prosecutors typically handle white-collar, drug offenses, organized crime. They don't handle, this is the 5th time we've been called out to this house with violence between these two people, an Indian woman and her non-Indian husband. And the woman might call the tribe, and the tribe's like, we can't do anything. Oliphant, we don't have any jurisdiction over this person. And it left a hole, a jurisdictional gap, and that was creating a lot of dangers for women and other people on tribal reservations. And so what you saw tribes organize and solve their problems in a couple of different ways by going to Congress. One more, oh, too far. I don't know where I'm going, maybe. There we go. VAWA 2013 is the first one. So you see tribes begin to organize and try to find a way for Congress to fix this issue. And they go to Congress and they say, listen, Congress, we need you to restore tribal jurisdiction over non-Indians in the tribe. Tribes should be able to, tribal police should be able to respond to a call in an Indian reservation where you have a non-Indian who's committing domestic violence against an Indian, and they should be able to prosecute that case. The tribe should be able to. And in VAWA 13, you see that happen. They created what they call special domestic violence jurisdiction in the tribes, and tribal jurisdiction was restored. I mean, usually when Congress acts in Indian country jurisdiction, it does not turn out well for the Indians. But in this case, because of advocacy by Indian country, it did turn out well. And you had these new provisions of the law that created special domestic violence jurisdictions. So tribes were able, for the first time since Oliphant was decided, to charge non-Indians in their courts. And you saw on the other side of that slide, you see where Cherokee Nation passed those provisions into law. Chief Hoskin was Secretary of State at that time. Chief Baker was in office. And you see Cherokee Nation lining up to say, yeah, we want this jurisdiction. Not all tribes have the capacity to exercise this jurisdiction. It creates some special requirements, but you see Cherokee Nation and many tribes step up and say, yeah, we need this jurisdiction, we want this jurisdiction. But there were still some holes in the grant of the restoration of authority. And one of them was if you had a stranger rape, because one of the issues with special domestic violence jurisdiction was there had to be a relationship between the two parties. So what if you had a stranger rape? Then the tribe didn't have jurisdiction because there was no relationship. What if you had two friends and one friend, two people who had only a friendly platonic relationship, and then there's a rape between those two people? Well, because they don't have any sort of romantic relationship or any kind of sexual relationship, it wasn't possible to charge that case. And also, what if officers showed up to arrest a non-Indian, and then the non-Indian fights the officers and hurts the officers? The tribe couldn't charge the non-Indian for the crime against the officers. So then you have new amendments, and you get VAWA 22. And it includes things like obstruction of justice. It restores tribal jurisdiction over sex trafficking. It restores tribal jurisdiction over crimes of sexual violence, including stranger rapes. So that is another restoration. And again, this is advocacy in Indian country led by tribal people seeking for ways to solve their problems. They didn't ask the United States to prosecute these cases. They asked for jurisdiction to prosecute them on their own. I mean, that's the difference between a tribally led solution to a problem and one that is requesting other people to, we're not relying on other people to solve their problems, but ones that are problem solving that is led by Indian country and led by elected governments themselves. So I think, there's a question then of what is the vision of the future. I've talked about the past. I've talked about sort of how we got to this point. But what does the future look like from here? I certainly, especially now, the Cherokee Nation's been in the Supreme Court a lot since I've been Attorney General. I think we've had a case in the Supreme Court every year of my term. Or there's been an Indian country case in the Supreme Court that was directly impacting the nation during every year of my term. And so there's still a lot of things that are challenging. There are a lot of issues that are still, the state is going to continue to push on. We have a lot of challenges in front of us. But I find that I'm really optimistic because I think that tribes increasingly have a strong vision for what they think the future of Indian country should look like. And you can see the outline of that future. And I have one slide here that I want to share with you. So Professor Kalt from Harvard came to the University of Tulsa and spoke at a conference a couple of weeks ago. And he brought this chart with him, and it is the economic boom in Indian country. And all it is the growth in real per capita income in Indian country versus the United States in Indian reservations. So the green line is Indian reservations. The red line is growth in the United States. Indians on reservations. The other line is all other growth in the United States. I mean, this graph we should just put this on everything, shouldn't we? Like, Oklahoma should want every reservation it can get. And this is not because of gaming, because he has other slides to demonstrate this isn't just about gaming. Gaming helps, but it's not just about gaming. It's not just about federal spending. The magic sauce, the only thing that explains this growth is tribal self-governance. The only tribes that don't show this pattern of growth are tribes that are not permitted as a matter of law to exercise the powers of self-governance. You are the magic sauce. You are the magic that makes Indian country successful. You are the reason why Indian country is on the trajectory that it's on. And if you look across Indian country, I think you can see this vision for the future that I think a lot of people see. And I think that we are only limited by what we can imagine Indian country can be and by what we have the will to create. Because I think there's a place where we have an Indian country where we have indigenous languages that are not lessening in numbers, but they are growing in numbers every year. And that you hear the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokee language spoken in Tahlequah as much as you hear any other language. And I don't think that because I'm just a starry-eyed optimist. I think that because of the millions of dollars that the Cherokee Nation has put into its language program and its school and the new Durban Feeling Language Center. I think about a future where the reservation is a place where we draw in tons of tourists and people who want to come to Indian country, and they're drawn here by our art and by the movies. They want to see the place where that film that they love or that TV series they love was filmed, and it was filmed in Oklahoma. And I don't think that because of optimism, but because of the film office that Jen runs, and because of the art that I see in my tribe and in all of your tribes that's so exciting to people. And Eastern Oklahoma becoming this place where everybody wants to be, because it's a place where indigenous art and indigenous ideas and thoughts have taken hold and created something totally new and unique. I can imagine a future where we have innovative tribal justice systems that are respected by Indians and non-Indians alike for their professionalism and sought after as partners to tackle difficult problems. I think that because I already hear this from people who come to me and say, wow, I love so many of the things that I hear that Cherokee Nation is doing. I would love to know what you guys think about. I see that you guys are putting $100 million into tackling opioid addiction, and that you're building treatment facilities, and you're tackling behavioral health. And we know that that's the root of a lot of our problems too. I see the domestic violence programs that you run. I've met the people at One Fire. We want to know how you're solving these difficult problems that we still don't have a grasp on, because you guys seem to have some ideas that we don't have. I am optimistic in the future of Indian country because I see the investments that tribes are making, because their citizens are demanding that these problems be addressed, and because the tribes have the resources to address them. But most of all, because tribes have the human resource. They have people like all of you who are out there, who are part of the communities that they serve, who honor their grandparents and their great-grandparents and the sacrifices that they made, who remember what Indian country, what Oklahoma was like, what Indian country was like in the 1930s and 40s, who hold on to those memories and who can imagine a different future for themselves. And so I'm incredibly optimistic about the future of Indian country, not because of what Oklahoma does or doesn't do, but because of what the tribes do, and because of what they're capable of doing, and because of all of you. So anyway, thank you so much for your time. It's a genuine pleasure and honor to be here with you today.